Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. So, a few weeks ago, I did a video talking a little bit about art blocks where I touched slightly on lacking inspiration, and how I often come to handle it. Well, since then, I have been inspired by themes of time, and as far as I can tell, it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Yes, I have some environment things and character stuff planned for soon in the future, but last week I let myself respond to an inspiration given by time. And then that kind of led to another and then a few other ideas, and now here we are. So without much more delay, let's look at the early ideas for this image and just get into the discussions of it. This time began with two rough sketches. One was done in my sketchbook alongside ideas from the hourglass, where I mainly had been more focused on other ideas at that time, since the seasons had been more interesting to me. The second sketch was done digitally, when I truly turned my attention to this and the experiments I could have with it. It's one of the earliest in the video, where I had done it in about a minute with a mouse, since I was also looking at other things in the background too when I thought of trying it. It was more just get it on the page rather than make it look good. After sketching it with the mouse, I then sort of just left it for a while. I think it was about a day total, so I could finish what else I was doing and then see if the idea and concept still interested me. And well, it certainly did. It's why I went to give it a proper sketch and actually look at how I would be finishing it off. Also, if you like seeing this part of the sketching process, let me know, since I did want to include it this time to show it all and how it all would come together. Especially in the early phases, rather than just jumping into a finished sketch later on. Yet these sketches feature the eye, since that is the main connection to the idea that I had. See, this one works off the idea that time as a concept sees all, and that it is always present, whether we acknowledge it or not. I had the thought of the eye resembling a clock after last week's art, and decided that I would keep it somewhat subtle. I didn't want this piece to be so obvious as I usually make them, and this was how I could do it. The other part of these sketches were the figures sat in the eye. They were originally meant to connect people and time, sort of imply the casual tie that we all have to how it passes. It's why in all of the sketches they are calmer, sat without much hesitation or bother. However, I will say now that the person was later moved. They were probably the main part of the image and sketches that I was never really happy with, since I wasn't sold on their inclusion in this manner. You will notice that I work on it for a while. I continue with the process as if they will be present for most of the image and this video, yet only decided right at the end that I would want to relocate them. And that was after a bit that I was going to remove them. And honestly, I did decide partway through that I wouldn't want them included at all, and only changed my mind right in the final moments for all of it. Besides all of this, the sketching phase had been rather simple. I don't really have too much to go on about with it, as I decided when starting this piece to just experiment, and to trial a slightly different style this time instead. But to get into that, I do want to discuss the colours I chose to use here, as that makes up a large part of the overall outcome. I mean, changing it later in the process would have been a bit harder than normal. I guess I could have used a hue layer, but it's sort of besides the point, as I did want to try something new and look at a different process. So for colours, I looked for inspiration online again to see if I could find something that I wouldn't usually combine. Yes, I was looking at maybe including purple somewhere, but I didn't really go out looking for it. These are the palettes that appear at the side of the screen between the colouring and the sketching phases. I had originally intended to maybe pick one and go with it, which is why I had a range. Some of them were blue themed and purple, others looked at pinks and so on, so I could have added and expanded upon those. Yet that just wasn't how it ended up, as usual. Mocking in the colours showed me that I could include them all. I didn't need to really select a certain one since they all kind of worked together anyway. And yes, I did still intend to include a person at that phase, so I did look at how they may be present in it using one of the palettes. Though the palette that I focused on the person did later get integrated into the overall face as well. Even without them, it would look a lot better in the experiment as well, since I did include all of the colours as I went, and there was never really a set barrier on that would stop me from doing it. This actually leads me into the early intent for this piece, as it kind of leads us well into the details of it as well. Behind the scenes, I am starting to work out if I could possibly start including other forms of art here, like my paintings and such. There will be some changes happening in the coming months that may make it possible for me, which is also inspiring me to come up with ideas for paintings as well. Those are being noted down since, right now, I am a little bit stuck for space when it comes to painting and looking to record it. I can do one or I can do the other, which is not really any good if I want to do both. But how does that tie into all of this? Well, it's quite simple. I wanted to see if I could tie in a little bit more of the painting process into this piece, and maybe experiment with it all that little bit. So that means that I had been looking to include more presence of marks and lines in the work, and maybe not smoothly shading everything like I tend to in other pieces. I wanted to see how hatching may tie into it, as I commonly use that when painting for various sections, or if I could use more bold marks in terms of shading to focus more on the shapes present in the outcome. I want to paint, but I don't think this idea would work so well in that medium. So here we are, trying our best to experiment and combine the two. It's why there are actually less layers in this outcome when compared to normal. At some points, more like the eye and iris, I did tend to lean more on clipping layers again and use those to kind of keep everything editable or removable if I happen to dislike it. Yet for the quote-unquote background, which is really the skin, I did keep it more to a single layer at the beginning and only worked on others in later parts of the video when experimenting with the previously mentioned marks and colours. I do wish I could kind of explain the process a little bit more too, but it really boiled down to experimenting with various brushes in Clip Studio that I may not have otherwise used before, or come to really rely on much. There ended up being quite a few brushes that I found a purpose for here and there in this piece. These ones tended to be things like the ink brushes or the watercolour brushes. Yet, they have never really been as present in other pieces as they come to be in this one, which I had fun with. And I did come to really rely on them, since they blended so nicely with each other, and they worked a bit more like I would expect paint to. The gouache brushes that I tend to use can fight with me sometimes when trying to blend them, and that is really regardless of what I set their settings to, or how I adjust them, and I know that they are meant to blend. Yet they blend in a different way to the other brushes that I came to use, and they usually need a little bit of assistance from the blending brush set aside for it. I mean, the main blending brush I use is the gouache blender, so it's kind of in the name. With the watercolour and ink brushes, however, they would give me a softer blending where I wanted it, but also without removing the details around. So I could also choose for it to be a bit harsher of a blend if I needed it to be, and it just gave me a bit more versatility. They were quite fun to use and a nicer experience, and I will probably be using them again. I'm actually more surprised than I never thought to use them up until this point. I've only ever used them for small details, but never quite come to rely on them, and maybe that will change. And I really think that I will be able to find use for them in the future, since they worked really well in this one. To me, the outcome here doesn't look too different from some of my other works and images. It is closer to the painting stuff I do, rather than anything digital, but it isn't 1,000 miles away from anything recognisable as something I made. And I like this about it. It kind of shows the experiment process paid off somewhat, and there might be a few ways I could think to incorporate these in more digital things going forwards. By this I'm referring to both the new brushes and their use alongside the hatching process that I introduced across this one. But let's actually look at the details here, since I have quite a bit of time left and I really want to avoid my usual running out of it. After all, I do want to unpack the main aspects of this piece beyond just an experimental process and the basic idea that I've tried here. Now, this piece ties to time before all else. This is what I had been working off of, and it was kind of the core that everything built from. It sort of means that I didn't want to just draw a large eye and call it a day, or leave it as that, as it would kind of feel wrong. An eye can mean many things, which has its own merit, and it is an interesting route of inspiration for another day. But for now, time is my focus, which means it has to be included somewhat noticeably in this area and this idea. And for it to be suitably included, it would have to at least be implied somewhat pretty central. No matter if I wanted it subtle or obvious, it has to be there. If it's too subtle, then it doesn't tie back to the idea, and if I want subtle but it's too obvious, then it's kind of a debate for myself. But this is where the iris comes into play. My logic had been that it is rounded like a clock and would be fairly important on the page. Fairly important basically meaning that it would be the main focus of the page no matter what I would do around it. So it only made sense that I consider including it here of all places. Putting it anywhere else would only make it be disconnected, or it would feel it, since I wouldn't have to somehow combine the two elements, which is another idea for another time at the moment. This one, I wanted it zoomed in on the eye, where that is what grabbed the attention rather than anything else, which I kind of ran the risk of compromising if I went through any other idea. From deciding that, I then had to work out how I would want to do it. One idea I had was to make the eye so obviously a clock that they didn't remind of an eye at all. This route basically saw the iris a clock instead, with the hands and the numbers being the priority above anything else. Yet that got overshadowed by a second idea to combine them both. In early routes, I wasn't exactly sold on the number idea, and they didn't look right on the paper sketch. Whilst, yes, it highlighted the clock factor and time, it drew a little bit away from the idea that it was a seeing eye, which is, again, core to the idea. Time sees all, this is its eye. A clock could potentially hinder that. Besides, it was much more enjoyable trying to work out how to subtly combine the eye with the subtle aspects of a clock, while still alluding to it. Taking this route meant that this piece was far more subtle about its connection and inspiration to time, which is what I wanted. So in the end, I decided that I would include just the hands of the clock rather than the numbers too. I would have a lot more fun experimenting with another detail I will mention later when it came to the details of the eye anyway, and the numbers took away from that experiment before all else. In fact, they kind of came to take away from the entire piece overall, as they didn't fit. Now, the final detail to touch on with the eye is the choice of colour. See, I settled early with the idea of the skin being a mix of purple and blue. It's something I've done quite a few times before in paintings, as I really like the way it looks, and honestly I'm willing to mix quite a few colours when working with blue or purple bases, as I know it works well. But with the purple, I tied in elements of yellow as a complementary aspect and lighting too, which again helped add that little bit of interest to the skin in that area. It did mean that, for the eye, purple would be a little bit too much, and blue is very much in the same realm of logic. It would make it all very monochrome. After all, the purplish skin is something I've done before for a range of reasons. In one piece that I did, it was tied to mystery. In another, I used it with a bit more grey to tie into themes of death. For this one, it was a slight mix of them both, and applying that to the eye again didn't fit. After all, the eye is the part of the image that is the focus, and it is the part that ties to time more than anything, and that is ongoing. So for this reason, I could do something brighter. And in the palettes, I had these tones of pink and a kind of salmony colour that went well with everything else, but also stood out that little bit. I also kind of knew that I would be tying them then into the skin and the hair in sections, mainly through small and subtle hints and faint washes before anything else. But it would also be enough to tie this colour into the eyes if I made the red tones their dominant colour. It then would have been another matter to balance the eyes with the hint of blue and purple too, just so that everything remained harmonious. Though, to be fair, the presence of yellow also did a lot of that work too. This then slightly leads to the detail between the two major ones, just as we wrap up on the eyes and move into the next point. And this one here is quite quick. I did add this cracking impression coming from the eye, and that was for a few reasons. This was an experiment before all else. It was a little bit on the sketch that I felt I could potentially scrap, or I could go further with, and I could look at and make my mind upon it as I looked at it. And in the end, it was an experiment that I ultimately decided to keep, since I toyed with the ideas that presented time slightly differently, and this one did quite a lot for that. The first route that I experimented with were tears, where it was almost mourning something and looking at time's end. Yet I changed it to these splintering cracks across the skin from the eye. Time can take many branches, and there are theories of other universes where other choices were made which can be tied to this. However, I mainly tied the cracks to the theme of decay that time may bring, since time always brings an end. I also preferred it to any tears that I did consider, as it just kind of looked better. And again, the cracks aren't too distracting, they're a subtle hint towards the overall theme, and it doesn't take anything away from it, if that makes sense. So I decided that even if the theme and their point wasn't the most obvious thing in the world, that they could stay. So in saying that, it is about time to mention the person of the piece. They did have a few iterations and placements, both on and off camera. Originally, as I sort of have said, they were meant to be rather casual about the presence of time behind them, and sat in the eye or on the eyelid. It would have been interesting, don't get me wrong, but the more I worked with it, the less I came to like it. When I came up with it, I don't really remember exactly why I thought it read as something casual or someone's connection to time. I did sketch it a while ago and just recall that this is what I had been going for in the end. I kind of got determined to see if it would work and how it would potentially look more than anything. I wasn't sold on it, but I didn't want to write it off automatically over nothing or very little, which kind of meant that I gave in and kept trying. Evidently, I still decided to give up on it. I didn't like it, and it just didn't quite look right when put with the eye for a mix of reasons. For the longest time of this, I was also sure I was just going to cut them from the piece and call it a day. Yet right at the end, I added a small shadow before the eye at the bottom centre of it all. I figured that this placement made the most sense for the original goal, and it didn't subtract too much from the piece around it, and if anything filled in a bit of negative space that I wasn't sold on anyway. The person was then blurred a bit with some detail returned, but they are positioned as if they're looking up at the eye and facing it unlike before. It all just kind of worked a little bit better, all things considered. The tie better reads as someone facing the eye and consequentially facing time too. We can't see their face, so we can't exactly know how they feel about it, which is how I wanted it this time. People can feel very differently about time, and opinions change by the seconds on it. For some, it's a cause of great anxiety or nerves. For others, it could be a motivation to know that it's always ticking down. Honestly, between people I've met, there have been examples of almost all emotions that time can cause. So yeah, we can't see their face, and that is how it's meant to be. Now, the final quick detail here before we wrap up this is the writing that I added around. I added this to the eye and between some strands of hair. And I will be honest again, I had no clue what I was going to write until I actually put it on the piece and just kind of went with it from that point. The one in the eye had been the first part of this detail, as it was a trial and a test to see if I liked how it would look, and if it would add or take away anything. But the small writing from afar looks like lines of detail, or marks like on the skin. It doesn't take away but highlights the eye again to draw attention to it, which is why I then decided to add it to the hair as well. The bit on the eye talks about time seeing. It's the most obvious tie back to the initial idea that I would have added to it all. It talks about time never stopping or slowing, the hands continue to move, which works well with the position too. It's by the hands on the iris and further sells the idea of clocks and so on, with it also being something noticed when glancing twice at it, or you're having to look a bit closer to decipher what it says. So really, it's mainly important as it talks about seeing, which again brings in the very early ideas to kind of bring them back and put them in the centre. The details in the hair are a little bit different. They're similar logic, don't get me wrong, yet the placement in the hair kind of works off its own idea. The conversations in the hair are fragments and fractions of two perspectives. One voice on one line offers fears of time or sees it as cruel and unforgiving, something that only ever provides an end, whilst the other perspective is a bit more accepting of its inevitability. And I did choose these because these are kind of the two most common attitudes I personally see about time, and they were the two that kind of stuck out to me the most, as one is very negative and fearful of an end, but the other one is otherwise accepting. They still don't seem too happy about it, but they at least acknowledge it and can move on with it. The placement was then for two reasons, as I've said. One is that some people tie hair to memories, or more tie it to identity. So it seemed fitting to show this aspect here, as it can slightly change how it was seen in two ways. For memory, it can be previous conversations with someone else, or a conversation with a past version of a self that may have feared time that little bit more. For identity, it kind of implies how people view it, and it can be read in many more ways that I've just not mentioned, or that I've just not really thought about. But that really was part of the joy and beauty of this piece, is that there is obviously many things that I wouldn't have thought of that I'm portraying. Time is one of those things that I won't have thought of every single way it could be read, and that is where the viewer is invited to make their own. Now, also though, before we wrap up here, I just want to mention something before anybody else does. Yes, at the time of editing this, I've just realised that I never included the eyelashes to the eye. I really thought I had, and I have somehow gone an entire week of looking at this image to write the script and edit this video, without ever realising that I didn't include them. Either way, it will be the experiment I try before this video comes up, so we will have to see that one at the time of release more than anything. All of that being said, that is all we have time for today. I hope you have enjoyed and aren't getting too fed up with seeing time-related art over here. As mentioned previously, I will be looking at environments and characters sometime soon, as I am also working on other formats in the background. For now, have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!